Hi, I'm Joe,
And I'm Ricky.
and this is season 3, episode 10 of the Beer and Broadband podcast. It should come out on June 8th, 2020. And we're going to talk about some stuff today that is probably more on everyone's mind in May when we're recording this. It's not too far off, but um, a lot of places are still opening back up, but they're very limited. And so we're going to talk about some of the things that you can do as you go forward, and in times where you need to be separated out. Like if you get sick, but other people are able to go out, and like how you can like kind of separate yourself, because that's something we specialize in. We know a lot about that sort of stuff. So, and then we're also going to talk about Ubiquiti stuff, like one of their new devices that I'm just dying to get my hands on. And finally, the first thing we're going to talk about is some brewing, because I brewed wine, and some of the things I did that's different from the sweet red wine that I made to begin with. So I made a wine that we talked about a few episodes ago. I think it was episode. Um, I should have done this. It was episode 4 of the podcast for this season. So season 3, episode 4. Um, and I made a wine that I called, Joe's Sweet Red Wine. But it was made with Fleischmann's bread yeast. And while I like it, and I probably will continue to like target something that's like that to make a wine, I may not use exactly that yeast. It kept everything kind of cloudy. It made everything have it didn't it wasn't really a bready taste, but it's things that you associate with bread because of the yeasty flavor that you get in bread, especially
Mhm.
like risen breads and things like that. And some of that, and it didn't have some of the mouthfeel that I like from most wines. So I tried it again. I used the same thing. It's just grape juice with sugar, and then I added some tea and some raisins, and to a 2 gallon batch. And so now we're trying this one. It was made with Red Star yeast. So it's the Red Star champagne yeast, the Blanc, and it's 15.2% ABV, or roughly. I mean, it's never 100% accurate
Mhm.
when you're doing it with just a hydrometer. So what do you think about the smell to begin with?
Smells really good. Um, Sorry, I'm going back for a second. Smell.
Yeah.
It's got a very like juicy smell to it. Not in like a bad way in the sense that like it smells like juice, but like it just smells very fruity.
Hmm.
It's got like a good like almost like a sweet and savory
Yeah.
sort of smell to it. I really like that. I also really like the mouthfeel of it,
Hmm.
and I like the secondary flavor. I think we not for the podcast, but when you made something similar to this before that had the tea and the raisin, I do really like those secondary flavors. I think they
Well,
complement pretty well.
so that was when we were tasting my meat, that I put some of this in. But this I put it
Mhm.
in the primary, and that one that we tried I put it in the secondary.
Gotcha. It's hard to compare one to one
Yeah.
because this is like the different ABV content, that's the different the other stuff that's being brewed with it. It's not quite as pronounced in this one. So maybe that's a difference between primary and secondary. Maybe not. Again, it's not a one-to-one test, so it's hard to judge.
Right.
But I still think it's got some good flavors. They kind of get added in there. I'll say the primary is a little heavy, but this is such a high ABV wine. I don't think you can judge that yet. Like
No.
this is going to need to sit for several months before it really clears up enough to judge that. But I'd say all the stuff that you can judge for a wine of this ABV at this age, I think it's turning into something nice.
Well, by clear, you don't mean the clarity of the liquid. You mean the esters and the off gases that create those off flavors, right?
Yeah, it's got kind of like wet, not in terms of like mouthfeel, but wet as in flavor. Like it's a little bit muddied
Hmm.
right now, but that'll hopefully clear up as time goes on. So it'll be really interesting. I'm not sure if you plan on saving any bottles, but it would be interesting to see what does this taste like 6 months from now.
Yeah, I plan on keeping one bottle for as long as I can,
Hmm.
and seeing like how it tastes, maybe 2 years, 3 years from now. And then I plan on keeping one bottle, um, you know, in kind of a place that I tested, maybe in like 6, 7 months.
Yeah.
I have like 6 or 7 bottles of these, but I started out with 8, and I've drank 3, I think, because I had one that I initially that I was running out of bottles, and it just didn't have the right type of cap for it. It was a screw cap um, bottle versus not my corked bottles,
Hmm.
and so I had to do that. An interesting thing with this one is completely dry. It went to 0.990 ABV, so it
Really?
went completely dry. Yeah, it ate up all the sugar that was in it. So for a completely dry wine, this this is a very nice feel for me. The raisins, also, I can tell the difference in flavor between the Fleischmann's red yeast
Hmm.
wine and this one, and the raisins and tea in primary made a huge difference in what came through in the flavors that I was wanting to, because they were much more subdued than the ones that I put it in secondary. Because I made 3 batches of this wine. I don't have any of the second batch left. And the second batch was really good, but it didn't have it. The flavors were not as and the mouthfeel was not as pronounced. So, if you are into making wine, um, finding some things to put into your primary, if you're making like a juice wine, that's really the way to go, I think. And I'm
Well,
really excited to see what we do coming
yeah, I think it
next.
depends on what you want to have happen. Like you're right, they're a lot more subtle, but I kind of liked them when they were a little bit more like vibrant. So like
Hmm.
I like it in secondary a little bit more than primary, but that's like a personal taste. So, but I think that is the takeaway, and that's the big difference people talk about between primary and secondary. When you're adding it in secondary, since there's no longer any fermentation there, there's going to be no modification of those flavors. If you put it in primary, it does mute it some because it's also getting kind of churned up in the fermentation process. So if you want like really subtle secondaries, throw it in primary. You want really pronounced secondaries, I mean, like secondaries from secondary flavors, you put it in your secondary brew.
I think there's a way to possibly get some of the best of both worlds with this stuff, but I definitely just the idea of putting something either in primary or secondary um, that is going to bring out some of those things that you want, whether it's wood chips or I don't think wood chips by themselves would be able to do this. That's going to be my next thing to do. I've got some wood chips. I'm going to make probably another sweet red wine, um, and put some tea in it and all the other stuff that I've done in primary, and then I'm thinking about putting some more raisins and wood chips in secondary, and seeing how that kind of affects the flavor and what that could do to really make this like a much more, I don't know, fun. It's a fun experiment, I think.
Hmm.
So, and then what I was really talking about is I'm excited to see what happens with that strawberry wine that you made. Um, or it's not strawberry. It was we talked about it a while back. What was the one that you
Yeah,
made?
yeah, it was like an apple strawberry wine.
Apple strawberry. Yes, that's right. But I'm excited to see what you can do with that by playing with some of those mixtures and the things that you can add to it.
Yeah, that's probably coming pretty soon. We're down to only one more gallon of that one. So probably next week or two, I'll
Cool.
throw another batch together and we'll see where we go. I've been trying a lot of other teas, a lot of herbal ones, since I don't necessarily want. I don't want to say I don't want a tea flavor, but what I'm mostly looking out of the in the tea is tannins. You don't get a lot of tannins in white tea, but you get tons of tannins in certain herbal tea. So I've been playing around with those some.
Yeah. So I think you could do that, or there's there's some other teas that are like fruity teas that have like some fruit things added to them that you could use that would be really nice. So like there's one called Fruity Pebbles that you can order off Amazon that has like a peachy kind of flavor to it. It's not a it's got like peach and mango and some other citrus fruits to it, and I think that would be like a fun one to play with. It's good options for going forward, definitely for sure.
Yeah.
So well, I mean, we're definitely going to talk about that probably. We'll probably save some of that and talk about it in the next. We should have some new batches. The next half of the season. So in the fall, we'll be talking about these.
Hmm.
Um, so let's talk about what you do, or what your setup should be for having like a headphone setup, or a Voip phone or a cell phone when you're trying to do meetings. And like kind of from a business perspective, what you see as being like the appropriate use for all three. And the reason I'm saying that is um, I've had to kind of think about that with some presentations I was doing recently, and some things, and how some people use it. And I think it's because they're not used to working from home. They don't have the tools set up to do the right thing, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
So how do we kind of help people know, well, when's the right time to have like a Bluetooth headphone or a headphone with a mic? What is the difference between the two, and how do they do affect voice calls differently? When's the time to use like either a software VoIP phone on your computer, laptop, whatever, versus like maybe using a hardware phone or your cell phone. So let's talk about the microphones first, because I think that
Hmm.
there's two different things to talk about there. So where do you see the appropriate time to use a like a boom microphone that's maybe dedicated with like its own receiver and stuff like that, versus maybe a Bluetooth headphone that let's say like some AirPods, or something like that.
Gotcha. I mean, if we're running that analogy, we're talking about like a headset or a phone that have some sort of physical connection into the computer versus a wireless connection. Unless you really need the mobility, I kind of always go for something with a wired option. Like even my headset that connects to its receiver, it has a strong signal to that, but it's still a physical connection into the laptop. I feel things like Bluetooth, you're opening yourself up to, not really latency, but just like jitter, drop packets, interference, you know, those things, even if they're strong connections, are not perfect. And the last thing you kind of want is to be dropping in and out, either on audio or, well, I guess incoming audio or outgoing audio, because it just kind of sounds unprofessional. Apart from it makes it harder for people to understand you and you to understand them. If you're working from home, people always, I think, like to jump at that. Oh, well, if you were in the office, this would be a problem.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. So you always try and get that physical connection if you can. If you're in a place that you need to be mobile, you know, let's say you do things like site inspections, or maybe you go in between a bunch of storefronts, stuff like that. I can see some of these in-ear Bluetooth that like connect to your inner ear bones and stuff, in terms of like that's where they pick up their mic instead of like from your mouth. Those work fairly well. I've got to play around with some of those recently. But I do have to preface that with it's really only a good option if you need that mobility. If you don't need the mobility, if you're at your desk most of the day, or even if you're just in your office space most of the day, and it's just like the headset itself is wireless but connects to a receiver that physically connects in, I think that's your better option.
Yeah, so I agree with that. So I think whether you're talking about using a wired headset like a Logitech wired one, or even like a Logitech 8H100. So that is a headset that has a USB receiver that plugs into your computer. It is a battery powered headset. It has like 8 hours of talk time, but it has like a boom mic and it has Bluetooth also. The thing about it, and there's a lot of great Bluetooth headsets out there, so I don't want to. I'm keeping it like in the um, more affordable range, I think. And I know I mentioned AirPods, which are like around 150, $160 if you get the case and all that stuff. But like a less expensive sub $200 headset that you can plug in that price range to get the best experience for the people that are listening to you and the best experience for you, it is really, really just best to get one with a boom mic. Um, and whether you're using your cell phone or you're using a desktop phone, you could be using, like, let's say, a Cisco 8821. If you have a headset or something like that that's connected to that phone, you're going to get better um, voice quality if it's got a boom arm than not. Well, then that kind of depends on the microphone and things like that. But overall, you get kind of what you're investing into it in those sort of things. So I think that the use case though, where you can get by with something like an ear pod or something. Let's say that you and I just call each other. We have like a few minutes to talk, and we're going to talk about something. It's just like a planning session. It's not customer facing, and I need to like multitask a little bit. I have to like kind of. I'm riding in the car. That's the time where using your Bluetooth headset, like your iPods or your Galaxy Buds or something like that. That's a time where that's like more appropriate, right?
Mm.
But if you're doing like a customer facing call, or you've got like a meeting with another team where you need to communicate like some sort of highly effective message, then you need to start looking at having, even if it's a wireless headset, something that's got a better microphone that is better at capturing the sound of your voice. And that that gets more expensive as you go up. AirPods are one of those weird things where I've had really good experiences with using them for phone calls. So they're kind of in a league of their own, but we know people that use them for everything, and it doesn't work for everything. Like, if you're in a group call where you're trying to talk and play a board game or something like D&D, it doesn't always work across the board. And so because of that, I find I find you have to like really know what you're doing, what you're planning on doing. And um, I think for that reason, it is much better to use like a headset type setup.
Yeah.
Um, so when's it appropriate to use your cell phone versus your like a dedicated VoIP phone, whether it's software VoIP or like a hardware VoIP? Like I'd mentioned, like something like the Cisco 8821 or Cisco, 8865 or something like that, where you're trying to use something, to communicate with someone.
Mm.
Um,
In my mind, the only time you should really be using your cell phone is again in that mobility aspect. And I guess there's the argument to be say, well, certain like software suites let you have a VoIP phone inside of your cell phone, but I'm going to count those as cell phone too, because the idea is you're still beholden to your reception, all these other things we talked about before with the wireless headset. Your packets can be lost. You can get this jitter in there. I find cell phones aren't as good as blocking out background noise as other dedicated phones are. So unless you're again you're wandering around places, need to have that one phone number people can contact you if you're in the car, or you just landed off of your flight, you're taking business calls, you're going between storefronts. Cell phone can make sense then because people kind of expect it because they expect you to be anywhere. They
Right.
catch you on a train, they knew that because part of your job is moving. But if you're again in a stationary spot, don't use your cell phone because that's almost going to be worse. Because at least if you're traveling between places, you're out in the open air. I mean, I don't know about everybody, but I've never had as good cell reception inside my house as I do outside on my front lawn. You know, especially if you've got things in your office that might produce interference, a lot of metal equipment. So
Hmm.
like my racks and stuff like that. Just don't go in there. I mean, if your company gives you a soft phone, use it. If not, I mean, there are very cheap soft phones available. I mean, like the whatever it's called, like Google Number or whatever.
Hmm.
I set up for some clients once, and they really liked it. Your physical connection to your network is always going to be better than whatever wireless LTE you can get provided from your cell company.
So I think that's the thing though. It's situation dependent. We go back to you're going to have a talk with your team. It's not really like that big of a deal. You're just kind of commenting on a few things. You're explaining something that's not mission critical. So it's just like maybe a check in or something. Using your cell phone in that moment, not a big deal. You need to go, buy some stuff for your kid, or you're taking them to the doctor's office. Put yourself on mute, listen in on the cell phone with like a Bluetooth headset. Not a big deal, right? But if you're doing something that's customer facing, or you're having like an important team meeting or something like that, you should make sure that you are in a spot that you have good connectivity. And so that can mean wireless connectivity. That doesn't necessarily mean wired. But if you're in a wireless spot, you have to really control that RF environment. So, don't put your um, you know device on top of a um, metal box, or put it in a metal box. It's even worse. Don't like stack APs on top of each other side by side. I guess is kind of okay. But things like that. And then like if you're like living in an apartment and you know that everybody around you has a wireless connection, you can forget having a good voice conversation. It's
Yeah.
just it's just going to have too much attenuation and interference. Period. There are ways that you can overcome that. You can put things in like a Faraday cage and just have the one signal inside of the Faraday cage versus outside, stuff like that. I mean, I've seen people go to some extreme stuff, for their offices, but that it's easy enough just to get an Ethernet cable and plug your phone in or your laptop in to whatever thing that you're setting up to have your, whether it's like a hardware VPN device or just a modem router combo. Figuring out how to have an Ethernet cable that sets you up for that is much better than going the other way around. Um, I've done it before in an apartment setting in a small office. You know, just from experience of trying to do wireless in an apartment. When I moved to a house, so I have a wireless Voip phone that I use for testing stuff, and that phone never worked. It didn't matter if it was 5 gigahertz or 2.4 gigahertz. It never worked in my apartment, no matter what I did. I'd walk around, and unless I was real like super close, I had to be in the same room, but I couldn't be right beside. I had to be kind of like 2 foot away. It only worked in that one spot because that's just like the place that the access point could get to it the best. But if I took it into any other room or anything like that, I constantly had issues with it. It'd work for a little bit, and then it'd drop out. I'd drop calls, just like everything. And that wasn't like a cell phone. Cell phones compared to that are a little bit more reliable, but every time I tried to use a cell phone or something, it just didn't work. But as long as I had an internet connection, if I used my, hardware wired phone, it worked, and I didn't have a problem with it. And I think that's the sort of thing that you have to look at when you're looking at mission critical calls, customer engagements, and things like that. And then, you know, mission critical calls, you can probably be on speakerphone in your office, separated from everyone else, long as your kids aren't running around in the background like screaming and yelling, you don't have your dog barking and stuff like that, everything's fine, right? But
Hmm.
if you got those things going on, put on a headset and mute yourself,
Yeah.
and only talk when you need to talk, right? But if you're doing a presentation, get in a quiet room, put that headset on, lock the door, don't let anybody inside, that sort of thing. Which kind of brings us to the next thing, but I don't want to jump off this topic. Is there anything else that you have to say about this, like as far as like advice for people that are out there needing something, some guidance? Like, how do I set this up so that I'm not driving myself crazy or spending $1,000 to get myself in a position that I can, you know,
Yeah. I mean, I think you can, for not that much money, get yourself a nice setup. Get a good wireless headset that either has a direct receiver with good reception. And remember, most of these USB receivers, I think you brought up like the H800s, they're directional. They don't actually go out in a radius, they only go in one direction. So make sure that that's positioned in a way that looks good. A trick I used to use for that, if I had desk constraints, like where my computer could be, is to get one of those really, they're not expensive, they're only like a foot long, they're like little USB extenders.
yep,
That way you can position the receiver exactly where you need it so that you've got good connection out to the rest of your office. Those aren't that expensive. It's a big bump in quality. Your soft phone, you'll have to figure out what works best for you. Either something your company provides or something you set up yourself. But even with those little things, and make sure you're familiar with your mute button. I work with several people, love them all. They don't use their mute button enough, and you can catch them all the time whispering stuff to people.
yep,
Your headset is literally inches from your mouth. You can't whisper soft enough for it not to pick up.
yeah.
So just learn where your mute button is, and that's really all you need. You can do that from anywhere between like 80 to like $300, even at like $300 being the high end. You know, it's not too expensive to do this stuff. If you just kind of think about what you need your layout to be.
So that brings me into, since you said layout, um, your office space or your dedicated space for work. Now, there are people with micro apartments and stuff like that, and I'm sorry, that's not going to work, in this sort of situation. But what I'm talking about that is like if you live in an apartment or a house, and I don't care if it's your bedroom, I don't care what it is. If you're having to stay at home for whatever reason, or you're working from home, you need to have a dedicated space, a place where you can sit comfortably and work and have all of your equipment and it not get in the way of everyone else, and you not turn, your whole house into some sort of lab or something like that. But a place that you can separate yourself out, everyone can work, and especially if you have another person that's working in the home, you both need your own dedicated separate space for these things.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? What does that space look like? It probably should have a door that you can close so that if you've got kids or pets, they can't interrupt you during meetings or times where you need to be concentrating on things. Um, it should be a space that is large enough that you can comfortably sit with something like an office chair, or I prefer not to use like kitchen chairs and kitchen tables unless I have to,
Yeah.
because I've had to do that before. If there is an office chair available, I'll oftentimes pull it into that kitchen chair. Is like whenever I travel, sometimes I have to use like a kitchen table to work from. But I go into a separate room, and then I tell if I don't have a way to shut a door, I tell everyone, look, be quiet.
Mm.
If you're talking, I'm going to come in and I'm going to tell you to shut up. Yeah, so be quiet. I have to work. I'm going to have phone calls. There's going to have to be some sort of give and take there. So it's just really important to keep that in mind when you're setting up your space, because if you don't, then people don't like they don't think about it, but they don't respect it because they don't think about how your work needs to be done and how they're going to be interfering with that. You know.
Yeah, you kind of gotta have some. If you're not gonna have a separate room, there do have to be ground rules that kind of get respected. Because I've worked from home in a couple different places. Not all of them was I able to have a room with a door, but it all worked out because the idea was, look, between these hours when I'm at work, this section of the house is my office. My wife used to get home before I got off of work. My desk was not directly in the living room, but it was in like what was supposed to be like the dining room alcove, so not very far from it. If she'd been watching TV, you'd absolutely be able to hear it. But she knew, hey, for the first half an hour when I get home, if I want to watch like videos on YouTube, I do that in the bedroom
Right.
because it needs to be quiet out here. Now that I got a soon-to-be 3-year-old, probably gonna still need that door. If your kids get old enough and can respect that, you don't necessarily have to have it. Like some of the apartments I've looked at recently have like nice little loft areas that could be okay.
Yeah.
If I had an older kid,
You
probably
know,
not at
I,
3.
I, I had an older kid who had a really hard time respecting those boundaries and letting me do whatever I was going to do.
Yeah, that's
So,
true. I mean, that's asterisk based on what your kid's personality is
yeah,
like. But I think you can get away from it needing to be a dedicated room if you don't have it, as long as you think the other people in your life will be able to handle, from my 8 to 5, this is a quiet space.
yep, I agree with that completely. So, I mean, maybe this is like a conversation that our listeners need to have too. We have, if you're listening to this on YouTube or just on our Podbean site, there's places for you to put comments in and talk about it. And you could also tweet us and let us know what you think about, the working from home thing, especially with the stay and shelter in place orders that most places around the world have had recently. This is like a really important topic now, and
Yeah.
facilitating and guiding people in the best way to do it is super important, I think.
Yeah, it is. And there are going to be a lot of people in situations that, since they're not full time teleworkers, the chance that someone who's been thrust into this just had a spare room they could use is fairly low. So, it'd be interesting to see how are the people that don't have the space to set up an office. What have you been doing that's been working for you?
Yeah, exactly. And I think um, maybe there's ways for you to talk about these things. Like it may be important in the future for some people to be able to kind of share that advice of this is how you do this, and um, you know get on maybe a web call if you have a colleague who's really successful with
Hmm.
this and say, hey, I don't know of any services that would do this for you, but look at my space. Let me just walk you around, maybe with a camera or something. Walk you through each of the locations that I have available to me, and which out of these would you suggest for this sort of work? Whether you're taking support calls, or you're designing something, or you're coding, or you're writing, typing to edit and do things like that. Those are all things that you can really get into a spot of needing advice about how to do certain things.
Mm.
So let's talk about the Ubiquiti Dream Machine Pro. So I don't think that we ever talked about it, but there was a Dream Machine that Ubiquiti put out, and it's basically one of their access points in this like little tube. It looks like Apple's old trash can Mac,
Hmm.
and it's like an access point on top in a tube that has one of Ubiquiti's cloud keys and a 4-port switch and one of their USGs. And it's got an IPS and IDS built into it, and it's supposed to be fantastic. Like the people that I've seen review it, love it. But one of the things that I had a problem with about it, and one of the reasons I just wasn't super excited about it, is its form factor and the way that it's made. It's not really like that modular, and you wouldn't be able to like kind of integrate and pop pieces out and put new things in and stuff like that. With the USG, um, or the cloud key. I'm sorry, the new cloud key too. They have a hard drive in them, and you can have, if you have Ubiquiti cameras, you can have that also work as your security suite, right?
Mm-hmm.
And things like that. Well, then they came out with the Dream Machine Pro, and I am super excited about this thing. For less than $500, you can get a um, gigabit. I think it's even got some multi-gigabit ports on it.
Yeah,
Um,
10 gigabits.
yeah, so you can get a 10 gigabit router um, that's software defined that has, I think, 8 ports on it. It has, multi-switch. It's got a built-in cloud key. It's got a hard drive that you can swap out to be able to expand storage. It is the bomb, and it doesn't have a built-in AP, so you can just add access points to it. If
Mm-hmm.
you already have existing Unify APs, you can just add a couple more to it. I'm super excited about this thing. I'm probably going to buy one the next chance I get to buy some more networking equipment. And when I have like $500 or $600, I'm just going to plop one down and replace the smaller USG that I have downstairs because it would avail me to be able to have more options for my
Oh
home
yeah.
network.
Yeah, I mean, especially for someone like you that's got Ethernet through the walls. I mean, that's
Hmm.
a great solution. I mean, you can run your APs directly off of it. I don't know if you've got like security cameras, but that struck me as like, oh, that's a thing that'd be really useful for this. You could run really everything in your house, unless you just had a whole bunch of devices that needed physical connection. Off of just one of these things, you can run your entire home network.
Well, yeah, off of one of them, but like even for me, I have multiple things that are set up that are Ubiquiti devices, and I have some lab networks and things like that that I am able to something like this. I would be able to get rid of the Cloud Key 2 I have, put that
Hmm.
hard drive in, like do some things like that, and it would be great. Um, I would be super excited about that. Somehow I put the wrong link here, so I'm going to grab the right link and put it on here. I put the link to the Microsoft earbuds.
Oh
I
yeah,
don't know
yeah.
how I
I didn't
got
know
that
if you
up
wanted
there.
to talk about those too.
No, that well I do later, not
Yes.
now. Spoilers.
Spoilers.
Um, but yeah, so I'm going to swap that out real quick from the Ubiquiti store. But yeah, so this it's right now on the Ubiquiti store. It's $380 basically to get this thing, and it's a one U rack. Has 8 gigabit ports, a console port, and then two 10 gig ports. Um, and it's got the NVR built in. Um, it's got the IPS IDS. If I understand all of what it's supposed to do, it will do that at 1 gigahertz, 1 gigabit. So you can your LAN ports that you have on there, it can do the intrusion detection and everything for the WAN that's coming in at 1 gigabit. It is just a beast. I am super excited about that. So yeah, is there anything else that you think I'm missing on talking about that?
No, it's a great little device. You know, if anyone's thinking about, hey, maybe I want to get away from just having 2 or 3 access points in my house that aren't really connected. I know a lot of people will just get like multiple Linksys and put one on each side of the house they've got a connection on. This would be a great way. It's certainly a little bit more expensive, but it's really an all-in-one device that can do your management. And the Ubiquiti APs are not that expensive. So it'd be real easy just to hook a couple things up to this, get a lot of protection, get a nice little all-in-one unit. I was looking through the GUI they use for these on their OS. That's real nice, real Meraki-like, you know. So I think anyone looking to kind of step up their network game, this is a really good way to do it.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Well, I think that just about wraps up this episode, unless you got something else that you want to talk about.
No, I'm good.
So thank you for listening. We really appreciate your patronage and the time that you spend listening to our stuff. We also appreciate all the people that are in these mandatory stay-at-home times that are out there supporting all of us that need your support. That we can't take out our own trash. We can't do any of the infrastructure stuff. We can't like necessarily grow our own food and feed ourselves just completely off that. So thank you so much for working at grocery stores and gas stations and all of the other things that you're doing. Um, but this has been season 3, episode 10 of the Beer and Broadband podcast. We really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Have a great day.